If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. This episode is about managing oneself. And you may think that's an odd way to say it, and you may think I've dealt with this before. In fact, episode 11 said something about needing to manage myself. But managing oneself is about a guy named Peter Drucker, who wrote a Harvard Business Review article by that title in 1999. Peter Drucker is probably the smartest guy that you've probably never read. I'll give you some background on who he is and why he's important, and you may have heard me mention him on the different episodes of the podcast previously. He really was an important thinker. He passed in 2005, I think, at like 95 years old, 94, 95, something like that. He wrote about 40 books. He was a management philosopher and consultant, and I'll do all that in background. But the reason that I want you to understand who Peter Drucker is because in the late 50s and early 60s, this is the late 1950s and early 1960s, he started writing about knowledge work. Knowledge work is the single most important phenomenon of the 21st century, and managing knowledge work is, I would say, the fundamental challenge of the second quarter of the 21st century, at least for businesses, business managers, and people who work in businesses, which at last count accounted for a lot of us. So these are thoughts that are probably important to you. And really what it comes down to is a justification for learning how to manage yourself and learning what that means and understanding how it has to work out in the world in order for you to have the highest levels of productivity that you can have, in order for you to do your best work in the world. And it's a comment to managers on how management should proceed through the next several decades, even, around this notion of knowledge work, why it's happening, what its roots are, and what Peter Drucker had to say about it now 60 odd years ago. So we'll get into it, but expect to take away reasons that you need to figure out how to manage yourself. And if you're a manager, if you have employees, if somebody calls you boss, some ways to think about management. So Drucker is, again, a management theorist, and a lot of his education was done in Europe. And he then immigrated to the United States because this was in the 30s and all the war and stuff that was going on. So he immigrated to the United States, became a professor, and wrote on what he considered to be sociology. But it was sociology in the sense of authority and social structures. And so then he gravitated over to understanding those sorts of things in the business world and became a business consultant. He did work at General Motors back in the heyday of General Motors, and this is in the early 40s, I believe. And he wrote a book out of that called The Concept of the Corporation, which defined what a corporation was and how it worked in society. At least from that point forward, his core thinking was, how do we manage the firm? How do our decisions and the way we act as people determine the outcomes of the firm? So kind of management and firm performance. We've seen some studies on this more recently. Google did Project Oxygen that talked about the manager's impact on the organization. Do we need managers? Are they important? Are they worth what they cost? Also, the Gallup organization over the last decade or so has been studying employee engagement, and they've come down very positively on the role of the manager. And by manager, that means each employee's direct report, direct boss, the effect of the manager on employee engagement, and has even come so far as to say employees don't quit companies and they don't quit jobs, they quit their manager. And so to emphasize the importance of managerial skill out in the business world. So that's really where Drucker was, is he was thinking about, okay, how do we exercise an authority in the organization such that the organization is more successful? And if you stop and think about it, that's a really big picture business question, and one that we still struggle with today because it touches on a lot of facets of the corporation and business in general that different people have thought about since then. Drucker was a student of his times, which meant that he observed what was going on. He was a consultant. He got paid to give his opinion. And so he was working with modern issues in business and in corporations at the time that he was working. And this is in the early 1940s through, I would say, probably the 80s. His writing continued. I think he published something after the turn of the century. So his writing continued late into his life. But to think that the bulk of his work would have been done in that 40 or 50 years between, late 30s, early 40s out into probably the 80s. And the kinds of things that he would have seen as he was consulting would have been, the heyday of the corporation, General Motors as an example of a great corporation of its day, and others along with that. So he would have seen that. He would have seen how Western economies changed on the basis of the factory and the modernization of production out into mass production. And he was profoundly affected by the economic implications of that, about how that technology, if you will, made our lives better through making products cheaper. It made us all wealthier people. And he was very impressed by that. He would have seen some of the challenges of management in very large organizations that resulted in some labor challenges in the 70s. Productivity was down in the 70s. Blue collar workers, particularly factory workers, had started having struggles with the kind of work they were engaged in. So management was having to deal with that kind of motivation. Job enlargement became a big term, basically rooted in the 70s. We were working on how to help people get more job satisfaction rather than just thinking a paycheck would motivate people effectively and keep them happy. So he saw all of this going on. He also saw the explosive growth of knowledge work in the economy. He was actually ahead of it a good bit, ahead of what I think is the first and probably loudest big bang of the knowledge work economy. He, in the late 50s, early 60s, coined the term knowledge worker. And we'll get into all this in some detail, and there are other episodes of the podcast that cover it to some degree. He talked about knowledge work and how it was important. And he talked about how that is the primary challenge of the modern manager. And here he's talking into the fourth quarter of the 20th century and then everything since then. I submit that we still haven't solved this problem to the degree that Drucker would have wanted us to by now. But what Drucker saw was the advent of knowledge work and how important it was to become in the economy. I traced the big bang, if you will, of knowledge work to the computer revolution. when there were many, many knowledge workers in a hugely and rapidly growing sector of the economy. And when the bulk of the workforce began to shift from manual blue collar kinds of jobs over into more white collar kinds of jobs. And the blue collar, white collar distinction sort of parallels manual work versus knowledge work. But again, we'll define knowledge work fairly closely. What Drucker saw was that if the economy was going to grow in the knowledge work space, that knowledge work productivity would have to improve in ways similar to how manual work improved in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. As an economist and a sociologist, he saw that the wealth production of Western economies was based in this growth of productivity of manual work. If the economy is going to shift over to knowledge work, then we're going to have to grow the productivity of knowledge work as well. And he was very concerned about how to do this. Also, as I said, he was a student of his times. In addition to seeing the shift to knowledge work, he also understood the impact of Fred Taylor and scientific management that were working in the Ford factories of the first half of the 20th century. So he saw the impact of scientific management on productivity, and he saw the fact that those more highly productive systems and modes of management could be transported. And they were transported to Japan while Drucker would have been studying and watching and consulting. And that affected him profoundly because it meant that the work that the industrial engineers, if you will, the scientific managers, it meant that the work that they had done is portable and thus more useful and more theoretically based as this work went over to Japan. And Japan became a production powerhouse. Edwards Deming was the primary figure of that Japanese productivity resurrection that culminated in the 70s and 80s, and then on out into what we now know of as Japan being a highly productive society based on learning, primarily learning, and now extending the lessons that we learned in the Western world throughout the 20th century. But one of the key insights that Drucker had was the importance of knowledge work. And now we're really seeing it in 2024, what a huge percentage of our economy is based on knowledge work. The robot in a factory has grown in capability to the point where fewer and fewer humans are needed to produce the things we are trying to produce. So we're seeing more and more of this work become knowledge work, become thought work. A lot of it is becoming service work, and Drucker had something to say about that as well. But this notion of knowledge work and deep insight into managing knowledge workers is the primary thing that I would say Drucker contributed. So we define knowledge work, and I've done this elsewhere, and you may be tired of hearing me say it, but here we go. Knowledge work is work that's done with your brain as compared to work that's done with your hands. So if we say manual work is work that's done with hands, tools, strength, muscles, and then knowledge work is work that's done with brain, information, thoughts, schooling, then that's a pretty good distinction between the two things. It's important to note that knowledge work and manual work are on a spectrum. In other words, it's very difficult to identify work that involves no knowledge on the one end of the spectrum. It's also very difficult to identify work that requires no physicality whatsoever. So in the middle is this spectrum of how much of your work is mental versus how much of it is physical, and just generally dividing into kind of knowledge work and manual work. I talked about defining service work may be right in the middle of the spectrum. If we think of service work as being everything from somebody making French fries at McDonald's out to robot-aided brain surgery. So service work is, if you will, applied knowledge work. And it's typically defined as service work is typically defined by the need of the provider and the consumer to be physically co-located. But it also requires perhaps extensive knowledge, technician level knowledge. So if we think of service work as being people who come out and repair things, you've got to have extensive knowledge of systems in order to be able to do that. The level of knowledge that service work requires helps place it on the spectrum, but it's in the middle-ish. Factory work may be kind of towards one end, and then service work may be in the middle, and then knowledge work like consulting, marketing, academics, the development of new knowledge, these kinds of ideas are out to the right-hand side. Computer programming is out to the right-hand side. So I mentioned the rise of knowledge workers in Western economies, and I trace that back to the explosive growth of computer programming, work that's related to what I refer to as computer programming is taking up a huge percentage of the economic input in Western societies. Many, many people are engaged all their time in computer programming or tasks similar to computer programming. That rise in knowledge workers caught the attention of managers because managing software developers has always been challenging because they showed up as experts in their fields. We quickly learned that trying to tell an expert how to do a job is a challenge, but we didn't really understand why. And then looking back on it, Peter Drucker was telling us why, but we really couldn't see it at the time. And I think many people still don't see it. I don't think Drucker is nearly as widely read and nearly as widely talked about as he probably deserves to be. And so part of the purpose of this episode is to take care of some of that. So in our work today, we'll talk about Drucker and we'll talk about how he laid down the challenge of modernizing knowledge work or helping knowledge workers be more productive along the same curve as management and technology helped manual workers become more productive in the first 3/4 of the 20th century. So productivity for knowledge workers is similar to productivity, I would say, for manual workers. Productivity is the outputs per unit input or some idea like that. I think that can be oversimplified in the knowledge workspace for reasons, quite frankly, that we'll talk about a few of those reasons today in this episode. So productivity is knowledge workers being able to produce their outputs, being able to do their work at the highest, most effective levels possible. And how can we, as knowledge workers, support our own productivity? How can we, as managers of knowledge workers, support our knowledge workers' productivity and make them more effective in the work? And then managers do have a responsibility in this area, because if you're a manager in a firm and your firm employs lots of knowledge workers, then the effectiveness of your firm and the profitability of your firm is going to be heavily influenced by how we manage knowledge workers. We've seen many managerial issues crop up under various names. Engagement's one of them. Work-life balance is one of them. Remote work is one of them. They seem to have cropped up on their own as an example. Well, work-life balance is a problem. It seems that happened sort of on its own, when in fact, I think it's traceable back to this shift to knowledge work, to the degree that the shift to knowledge work conflicts with managerial principles in the organization, then knowledge workers are going to be unhappy with how they're managed and are going to be less productive than they could be, if not outright job hopping and various counterproductive behaviors. So managers really need to get out in front of this and understand knowledge workers and understand how best to manage knowledge workers. And so the rest of this episode is going to be about that and the fact that Drucker was asking these questions 60 years ago. And we've been asleep at the wheel, not answering these questions ever since. Drucker wrote, as I said, 30 odd books and had a very long career. He wrote many articles for, in particular, the Harvard Business Review. His work got summarized and restated and covered again, both by his own writings and by other commentators and people who reproduced and repopularized some of his ideas. Today, we're going to look at the 6 factors that influence knowledge work productivity. And we're going to look at them based on a single article that appeared in the California Review of Management. And I'll put the reference to that article down in the show notes. But it's talking about, the article that is talking about knowledge worker productivity, and Drucker identified 6 factors and spelled them out for us. And I wanted to share those with you and to talk a little bit about how we can address knowledge worker productivity based on those 6 ideas that Drucker had. Seemed like a good place to start. So when we talk about these 6 factors, they're going to largely be things that knowledge workers are responsible for. When I say they're things that knowledge workers are responsible for, it's things that managers are typically responsible for in the old manual work economy. But the responsibility for these things has shifted from managers to individual knowledge workers. And that's why this episode is titled Managing Oneself, because in a knowledge work economy, for reasons that we'll explore over the next several minutes, knowledge workers have to do this management for themselves. Nobody else can do it for them. And we'll explain why that is. But a big part of what Drucker is explaining to us here is that responsibility for these 6 things is shifting from the manager to the individual employee. Another thing that we'll see is many of these 6 factors help contrast manual work and its management to knowledge work and its management. Drucker talked about these 6 things being ways to improve knowledge worker productivity. And management, in my view, is largely about improving productivity of people in the firm. So that's where these ideas overlap. And it really is, as I mentioned before, a manager's responsibility to understand and address these things. A way to understand and address these things is for managers to realize that they need to let these things go. And they need to exert less control in the organization or find different ways to exert control if they still feel like they need to. So we'll talk about all that. The first of Drucker's factors is he recognizes that in the knowledge work world, defining the task is not always straightforward. You may argue that defining the task is never terribly straightforward because it can be difficult in manual work as well. Defining the task being, okay, what do we need to do here? But in knowledge work, there are specific challenges to defining what the task is. And answering that question is critical in order to understand productivity, because productivity, if it's anything at all, is using fewer resources to complete the task. So understanding what that task is, and there are some nuances in knowledge work. One of the challenges is that when we define tasks in the physical product world, often we have things like models and blueprints, and we can do mock-ups, and we can make pieces out of plastic that are before we cast them in metal to see how they work and how they fit together. And that has become a primary way to define the task of physical work. What I mean by that is, oh, this gizmo needs a 2-inch shaft on it that's a 1/4 inch in diameter. Okay, well, how did we figure that out? Well, we figured it out by modeling it and drawing it and mocking it up and fitting it in with other pieces. So that's helped us define the task. Knowledge work is this information intensive work that we do. An author is a knowledge worker and produces a story that's written in words printed on the pages of a book. But the actual productive act is organizing the story and building the story and phrasing the story in such a way that people find it valuable. In the information world, we know that it can be very difficult to model an information product. The reason is that models and blueprints and things like that we use in the physical world are specific kinds of information, a specific slice of information around a physical product. That's why a lot of times blueprints can have electrical schematics rather than detailed electrical drawings of the shapes and size of switches, because we can abstract information that's needed and highlight it versus the physical properties that may not be necessary to know in a particular model. Information products, it's entirely possible that they can't be modeled in that way. In other words, that any sort of a useful model of an information product requires as much information as the product itself. So we really can't model what these things look like. If you think about modeling a book, well, that's fine. Perhaps there's an outline that's a model for a book. But the outline is so far removed from the actual product. You could give the same outline to 2 different authors and get 2 completely different products out the other end. On the other hand, if you give a blueprint to 2 different craftspeople, you're going to come up with substantially the same product. That's a challenge of defining what the task is there's really not models that we can use in the information world. Another challenge is that in the information world, we don't duplicate things. Creating the second copy of a book is a far easier task than creating the first copy. And this is true in fundamentally different ways than the challenge of creating a second clothespin once you've created the first one. The second instance of an information product is just a question of reproducing the information, making a copy in ways that simply can't be done in the physical world. What this means is that there's very little value in reproducing information artifacts. As such, there's great value in producing them the first time. So defining the task is a challenge. A lot of people have to be involved. A lot of organizational thought has to go in. It's going to be a controversial thing, but defining what the knowledge worker's task is a fundamental challenge of helping them be productive. So we'll have to think about that. Another facet of influencing knowledge worker productivity is who's responsible for the knowledge worker's productivity. Who's responsible to keep the knowledge worker, say, on task? Who's responsible for defining what's a good day's work in knowledge work? Who's responsible for making sure that the tools are in place and that everything's ready for the knowledge worker to begin. In order for knowledge workers to be productive, they've got to be responsible for their own productivity. This is very different than manual work in the sense that in manual work, the factory defines how many lug nuts you need to put on a tire every day. And you either can do that or you can't do that. Well, in knowledge work, it's not nearly that simple. I'll give two examples. One is managing knowledge work. Knowledge work happens in your brain and it's unobservable. So any boss or manager that you have who tries to tell the difference between you thinking hard about the problem that you're trying to solve and daydreaming can't do it. That means that the knowledge worker, him or herself, is responsible to be producing knowledge work outcomes when it's the right time to do so. Because there's nobody that can stand over their shoulder and go, oh, you're not thinking hard enough, or you're not thinking about the right things, or you're not thinking in the right direction. They have to do it themselves. So they have responsibility for productivity. That's idea number one there. The second is a good knowledge worker literally knows more about their work than both the boss and the customer. And this is one of the fundamental challenges, is that knowledge of the work and what's possible, how it's best done, where the boundaries of the knowledge exist. So for these two reasons, the responsibility for productivity has to be with the knowledge worker, him or herself, which is a challenge for many managers because they're used to motivating productive behaviors. And if they are in a position where they're not needed to motivate productive behaviors, they feel out of control. And that can cause problems in the management of knowledge workers. But the key takeaway for us is that knowledge workers need to be responsible for their own productivity. A third factor is improvement in methodology needs to be in the knowledge worker's hands. This also goes back to the unobservability of knowledge work and the knowledge that's resident in the knowledge worker, him or herself. The result is that the knowledge worker needs to be continually innovating, continually trying to find out better ways to produce results. Now, this is very different from manual work in the sense that the responsibility for continuing innovation in manual work has historically been the industrial engineers, the people who design the factory, the people who design tools for people to use, have had the responsibility of developing new methodologies that make people more productive. So again, a big difference between manual work and knowledge work, and thus a big difference between managing manual workers and managing knowledge workers. A fourth component, a fourth factor that influences knowledge worker productivity is the notion of learning and teaching. Knowledge workers need to be responsible to continually learn, and they need to be in a position where they can continually teach. And we'll talk about each one of those individually. Continuous learning. I think historically it's been true that the boss told the worker how to interact with the factory. In other words, the worker showed up and said, I'm a strong, capable human being with good hand-eye coordination and some, as I said, strength. Tell me where to stand and what knobs to turn so that I can help you be productive. Knowledge work is not that way. Knowledge work is an expert level task, and the knowledge needed to do the task is the thing that's continually growing. So knowledge workers have to be constantly learning. There's never good enough knowledge of how to perform a task. Continuous teaching is a little more subtle, but it has to do with how knowledge workers need to be able to inform customers, both customers within the organization and customers external to the organization, what the knowledge work result is good for and how good it is. An example here is a statistician will deliver a statistical finding to you, but they also have to tell you how accurate that statistical finding might be. And as the accuracy of their findings improves for whatever technical reason that we don't understand, they need to continue to tell us that so that we can continue to understand how to use their result and how much confidence to put in their result. So knowledge workers have to be engaged in continuous learning and continuous teaching, and they have to do it under their own responsibility because nobody else can see what they need to learn and what they need to teach because other people are not experts in their areas of knowledge. So continuous learning and teaching. The fifth factor that influences knowledge worker productivity is the notion of quality. I'll say that only the knowledge worker can determine what level of quality is possible in their result. Back to a medical doctor diagnosing your symptoms. Only the doctor can tell you how confident to be in that diagnosis. This means that only the knowledge worker can explain the level of quality of any particular result. Another notion around quality is that overproducing quality is waste. If you produce higher quality than your customer wants or is willing to pay for, then something is being wasted. Some material is being wasted, some time is being wasted, something is being wasted and not getting paid for. And this is a particular challenge in knowledge work because defining the level of quality necessary in the product is such a challenge. But overproducing that quality is waste. In the case of knowledge work, many times only the knowledge worker themselves can explain the level of quality. And so that challenge is always there for the knowledge worker. In addition, we have perfectionist tendencies that make us want to overproduce on quality. By we, I mean humans, not necessarily just knowledge workers. And we've got to manage that and bridle that because of this fear response that we sometimes have. And I'm confident I've explained this in some detail in other episodes. So when we look at quality, not only is it difficult to define in knowledge work products, it's easy to overproduce, and thus it's a challenge to those of us who manage knowledge work because it's very difficult to look at a piece of knowledge work and go, this is not good enough, or, hey, you spent too much time on this. The quality is emergent rather than something that can be predicted as it is predicted in the manual work. So this notion of quality is a heavy influence on knowledge worker productivity. The sixth factor, and Drucker identified this very clearly, the sixth factor is motivation. Knowledge workers have to want to work for the organization. The clearest indication of this is that the knowledge worker owns their own productive assets. The typical productive asset in knowledge work is education and experience. And those are things that can't be taken away. In a manual work job, say in a factory, when the worker leaves the factory, the worker leaves behind the tools of their job, and in many ways cannot be productive at all outside of that factory setting. And this is certainly not true with knowledge workers. Not only is knowledge work portable from organization to organization, but it's also portable in and out of the door every night. Now, Drucker interpreted this as the need to treat knowledge workers as assets rather than as cost factors. And that may be what needs to happen in the accounting and economic side of business. But for now, what it means is that this level of engagement is very important. So they've got to want to work for this specific organization. They've got to believe in it and understand it and agree with its principles and value in the world. Further, they've got to have deep desire to work. Slacking is very easy in the knowledge work world because productivity is so hard to define. So when we use the phrase want to work for the organization, that has a twofold emphasis. Want to work for this organization is one emphasis, and want to work or driven to work is another emphasis. So we've talked about these 6 factors, and I'll review what they are just for our mental clarity here, because that was a lot of work. And then we'll start looking into how the factors directly change productivity of knowledge work. So the 6 factors are clearly defining the task, giving the knowledge worker responsibility for their own productivity and giving them tools to maintain their level of productivity, recognizing that continuing innovation has to be part of the knowledge worker's job. They're the only ones that can do the innovation. Recognizing that continuous learning and teaching are also parts of the knowledge worker's job. They're not optional. Continuous learning is what really drives knowledge worker productivity. The 5th is being very clear on quality, and in particular, avoiding the waste of overproducing quality that so easily crops up in knowledge work. And then the 6th is that knowledge workers have to want to work for the organization. They have to be highly engaged for reasons that we talked about. So now we'll move over into thinking about how all this applies to knowledge work productivity. And if we look at the 6 factors, we see, 1, that they're all aspects of management as it relates to manual workers. And 2, that the responsibility in almost every case, the responsibility for these aspects has moved from the manager to the worker. And we have to allow that movement in order for knowledge workers to be more productive. The manager has to allow the knowledge worker to take responsibility for these factors, and the knowledge worker has to be willing to take responsibility for these factors. And if both parties are stuck in some manual work mindset, then it's going to be very challenging for either one of them for the give and take that we talked about to happen. I'll go so far as to say that what Drucker's telling us with these 6 factors is that knowledge workers have to engage in self-management. That management is not something that other people can do for them, at least management as we typically think of it being based in typical manual work management. So self-management is the order of the day here, and our organizational structures don't really allow for that. Our organizational structures are built on control, not on freedom. And they're built on hoarding power, not on distributing power down into the organization. We've seen aspects of this in so-called enlightened management and in job enlargement work that was done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The problem with self-management and the problem with tasks moving from the manager to the worker is that historically people are not taught to do management. They're not taught what management is. They don't know that these 6 factors, for example, are aspects that managers of manual workers should be responsible for. It's not clearly defined for them. And so when we talk about managing oneself or managing others, people are not trained in these areas. So now we understand that this training needs to happen throughout the organization. It's not just people with a manager title that need to be taught to manage, because the principles for self-management and what I'll call managing other people are not that different. One of the areas where we often get hung up thinking that They're very different. Thinking that managing yourself is very different from managing others. One of the areas where we get hung up is on motivation. We think that it's the boss's job to motivate worker behavior and worker diligence. And we view workers as constantly, at least potential slackers. And we've got to change these mindsets as we go forward. The notion of knowledge worker productivity then is really wrapped up with the notion of how management should be done. What are the goals of management? It's possible that we could make an error by just saying, well, management is management. It's the same as it ever was. We don't need to change anything. And I would argue that in the first place, we haven't been doing manual work management all that well. And secondly, that if we continue to do what we've been doing, then we're going to get bad results in terms of the productivity of our knowledge workers. I would argue that we need to understand that our economy is changing. And when we have more knowledge workers and are more dependent on knowledge worker productivity, then we need to exercise our best skill set in trying to help them be as productive as is possible in areas so that our firms are as productive as they can be, so that waste is minimized, and so that firms serve their customers as best they possibly can. So, a conclusion for all this. I'll say, and Drucker said, a lot of it is just change in mindset. A lot of the work that we need to do is just recognizing from the worker perspective that they need to manage themselves. And that from the manager perspective, we have to come up with ways to coordinate work that are less controlling. I would say that giving up on these 6 factors that we talked about, managers relinquishing those factors into the hands of knowledge work, could be seen as a loss of the coordination of work. So the manager's task then becomes building new structures that help us coordinate work, that help us get work distributed out to people, but collected back up well, so that it can be done in parallel, to get that work effectively dealt with in ways that don't require us to exert the kind of control over knowledge workers that we've historically exerted over manual workers. So, mindset. Everybody's got to have an open mindset, both managers and workers. I know a lot of workers who will say, I don't want to manage myself. Just tell me what I need to do. Well, in knowledge work, that's not possible. And so to the degree that you're going to be a productive, effective knowledge worker, then you've got to take on those responsibilities for yourself. So mindset for managers, mindset for knowledge workers. Another conclusion that we can take away here is that access to tools and training has to change dramatically. Everyone is going to need access to the tools and training that they want to have. And organizations are going to have to recognize that training opportunities and learning opportunities for its human assets are every bit as important as oil for the engine that runs the conveyor belt. And it's going to have to be dealt with in those ways as compared to economized on. Greater access to learning, greater ability to take courses, greater ability to consult with one's peers, greater ability to make learning a part of the productive day of a knowledge worker. I think that training oftentimes is looked at as some sort of a productivity escapist activity. It's something that people will engage in when they don't want to do, quote, real work, unquote. And we're really going to have to make that access more readily available to the people that need it. And then my final conclusion is that we'll need to learn to manage if only to manage oneself. The principles of managing others and of managing oneself are not that different. So we need to get really good at managing ourselves individually, and that will make us both better managers of ourselves and better managers of others. I hope I've inspired you to take a look at what I consider to be one of the great management thinkers of the 20th century in Peter Drucker. I think it's continuing to prove itself as we see more and more how right he was about dealing with knowledge work. 60, 70 years ago, he was talking about the fact of knowledge work and even how we can do it better. And now what we need to do is to take those lessons on board and move it along. So I hope that you'll be able to move Peter Drucker from the smartest guy you've never read to somebody that you have read, and be able to take on the value of his foresight and wisdom in your own world. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.